our church cultures, our family cultures, our neighborhood cultures, our national cultures, and how they change us, how they shape us, how they make some choices seem legitimate and some illegitimate. They tell us a story about what a good life is, what a human being is, and they form us. And that interest took me from a very small village in Hampshire. I joke that I grew up in Privet Drive, in a very small, safe, middle-of-the-road, largely secular childhood, through an ecstatic conversion at an evangelical youth festival, through a major crisis of faith deconstruction, back into the church. And on the way, I've worked at the BBC, thinking about what are the stories that a big national media company is telling. How could we shape those to be more redemptive and more humanizing? I led a think tank, a religion think tank. And now I'm writing and thinking about those stories. And if you take one thing away from tonight, I want it to be the question, what is the story that your culture is telling? And how are you being formed by it? Where I come from, one of the big cultural stories is that it feels like the end of the world. I don't know if it's the same here, and it might just be my little bubble of overeducated philosopher, novelist, journalist friends in a sort of much maligned metropolitan intelligentsia area of London. I think it probably is different depending what generation you're from. If that's not true for you, maybe ask people a bit younger than you. You might find that it's true for them. I recently did a Google Ngram, which is this nerdy research thing you can do online, which shows you how often particular words have shown up in books over the centuries. And if you type in apocalyptic, there is a huge spike in the middle of the 1850s. And that's about what happened here. I don't know if you knew that the American Civil War was framed by both sides as the end of the world. A sign of the end of the world. It was all over the books and the newspapers and the pamphlets of the time. And then it drops right off the graph on the Ngram, spike in the 1850s, drops right off, very flat, begins to go up slowly in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and then in the last 10 years or so, huge spike. And there are reasons that, at least in my tribe and my culture, it feels a bit apocalyptic, right? We have a climate crisis. We have fraying trust. People no longer know their neighbors. Advances in AI, right? We might have properly let the genie out of the bottle in terms of the technologies that we have created. But you guys have got politics under control, so that's okay. Democracy is totally fine, in safe hands. And this story, whether it's true or not, whether it's accurate or not, was forming me. I felt a few years ago that I was becoming more anxious. Everyone else was more annoying, right? Other people were more wrong. I was tense. I was tempted to become a prepper, right? I was worrying about the future. Part of me wanted to hoard and just look after the people that I loved and stop trying to love my neighbor. I became less generous and less open-hearted and less peaceful and all these things that I believe my tradition is calling me to. And it really helped me talking to a friend of mine who is one of the atheists that I love, who's called Vanessa Zoltan, and she's one of the things she does is she's an atheist chaplain. And I asked her, because I know she also has quite a lot of existential anxiety, I said, how do you live with this anxiety, this worry about the state of the world? And she said, I try and focus on the question, if it is the end of the world, what kind of people are we going to need? How do we be becoming the kind of people the world needs now? And it really brought into clarity for me that there's so much I can't control. I am not able to slow down advances in AI. I cannot fix democracy. But I might be able to become someone a bit steadier, right? With spiritual core strength, able to love her neighbors, even in turbulent times. And funnily enough, my tradition has some resources for that. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but Christianity is an apocalyptic tradition. The New Testament is mainly made up of letters written between scrappy communities, trying and failing to love each other, trying and failing to love their neighbors, in the expectation that Jesus was coming back really soon. They were trying to find steadiness in the now and the not yet. They didn't believe that prosperity, safety, democracy, nice middle class, middle of the road lives was the promise or the premise for living as a Christian. Quite the opposite. They believed it was possible to be growing in faith and hope and love, to be becoming more fully alive in those turbulent times. And so it seemed like it might have something to teach me. And maybe this end of the world stuff is not working for you. Maybe that's not the story of your culture, and that's okay. Maybe instead you could ask the question, who do you want to be at the end of your life? What do you want people to say about you when you die? Bit brutal, I know, but I want you to imagine your funeral and someone that you love standing up to give a very short summary of the person that you were. What do you want them to say? They took some really nice holidays. Wrinkle-free forehead. In my case, too many serums, right? Really fancy job title, nice kitchen island. Yeah? No? Most of us long for there to be character words in that eulogy, right? Brave and loving and loyal and kind. We sort of hope, I think, if we are taking on Christianity at all seriously, that people might think we, even in the smallest way, looked a little bit like Jesus. And I don't know about you, but I don't think any of that is going to happen by accident. None of those things come naturally to me. I'm not naturally steady or loyal or kind or loving. I am distracted and selfish and grumpy. That is what comes naturally to me. But I want to be growing into the kind of person the world needs. And Christianity has always talked about this as formation. Yes, we receive our salvation as a gift. We don't earn it. That's not how we are acceptable to God. But also that we are called into a path, a rigorous spiritual path. The reading at the 8 a.m. service this morning was about orienting ourselves towards the works of the Spirit, not the works of the flesh. Right? We have some agency in this. We can make choices about where we put our attention and the relationships that we're in. David Brooks talks about this as eulogy virtues versus resume virtues. He says, most of what we spend our life being formed into, most of what we pay attention to, most of the cultural stories that we are swimming in are about how do we make more money or be more physically attractive or healthier or more impressive, right? How do we increase our status or our comfort or our convenience or our toppling pile of consumer crap? That's the story. Our resume virtues are what our whole culture is set up to be forming us into. The eulogy virtues, the character stuff, it's not going to happen by accident, I promise you. No one is going from the outside to help you become braver, more loving, freer, more peaceful. We have to choose to partner with God to receive this inheritance which he promises us. And so I've been thinking a lot about, okay, I am being formed by this cultural story. I'm becoming someone I don't want to be, but my tradition says it's possible to be formed more towards life and peace and hope and faith. And a lot of that, I think, is about these two things. What are we paying attention to and what relationships are we in? Those are the best predictors of who we will become. And I am very interested in monks. We live in a very small, intentional community. 2 families have chosen to live together with monastic rhythms and a rule of life, and we've turned the garage into a chapel. So I read a lot about monks and religious sisters, and what they do is they have taken their attention incredibly seriously, and they'll spend, if you're a Benedictine, between 4 or 5 hours a day praying together and reading scripture. They're literally strapping their faces to this story. They want to be formed by the story of this kingdom and this gospel. Do you know what I'm strapping my face to for 4 or 5 hours a day? I imagine you are too. Yeah, your phone. Your phone. That is what is forming us. And as well as this sense that if I'm not careful, the things I'm paying attention to and the relationships that I am in will be forming me away from the person I want to be, there's something else. And as Jonathan alluded to, that something else is something that, and I think you guys might be better at this, but my bit of the church, and particularly in the UK, is a bit embarrassed about talking about, which is sin, right? This word that my perception of was almost entirely negative, that it was something that was hellfire and brimstone, externally imposed guilt and shame, right? A kosh that we use to beat other people with, and they, understandably, run away from as a concept. Or sort of naughtiness, right? Calories, cream cakes. It was a little bit simple, you know. The liberated opposite of Puritanism. Honestly, I was a Christian for years and did not really know what to do with the concept, except I know I was supposed to be confessing them, but in my head it was sort of like a list. It was very much a binary thing. It was each action was either in the good or the bad column. You know, it was economic, it was legal. I've come to understand sin as a relational concept, as the thing that gets in the way of me being formed into the person that God wants me to be, the person that the world needs. I've come to understand sin as a relational concept that is about disconnection. Because I think we're made in the image of a relational God. That's what a Trinitarian anthropology, which is just a fancy theological term for a God who is love before even humans are created, means. If we're made in the image of that God, then we are made for relationship with that God and with other people, and that is how we are fully human and how we are fully alive. Not really individuals at all. We're persons in relationship, made for each other, made by each other. And when someone asked Jesus essentially what the good life is, what is the summation of the law, he said that. He said, relationship with God, relationship with other people. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Horizontal and vertical relationships. That is the whole of this message. That is what a good life is. That is how we do that thing where he said, I have come to bring life, and life in all its fullness. And it doesn't come naturally, right? Luther and Augustine both used this Latin phrase, homo inconvertus in se, to define sin, which means humanity turned in on itself. Something designed to move out into relationship, instead pulling back. Have you ever had an ingrowing toenail? Right? Remember the smell? Sorry, it's gross. Yellow pus or an ingrowing hair? John Donne said, man alone, humanity alone of all envenomed things, does work upon itself with inward sting. When we sin, we disconnect, we fracture, we withdraw from the relationships that we are made for, and we pull back into ourselves. And understanding sin as a relational concept felt so helpful. It felt so psychologically astute. It felt like I could name some realities about myself that I didn't otherwise have language for and I didn't really want to look at. That it was part of the puzzle for why it was so hard to be becoming the kind of person I want to be, to be becoming the kind of person I think the world needs. And having come to the conclusion that sin, at least one way of understanding sin, is that it is a relational concept about fracture, about break. Francis Spufford, who's a British writer and has written an amazing book called Unapologetic, calls it the human propensity to F things up. And he does not bleep out the F. And I don't, in the British version of the book does not, but the American does. Because my American publishers were like, we're not as sweary as you guys. We have delicate ears. So I am editing, but I actually, I'm not big on swearing for the sake of it, but that word is brutal, and it helps us hear the brutality of the concept. It is fracture, it is break. We talk about human brokenness. I think we need to be real about human breaking thingsness, right? Kant called it the crooked timber of humanity. But strangely, understanding that about myself didn't feel crushing, didn't feel psychologically harmful. It felt honest, right? It felt true. I have all these great values and aspirations, I want to be a good person. And then I really make quite poor choices very regularly. And I'm generally far more of a hypocrite than I would like to be. But what, frankly, the offer of grace and forgiveness, which always needs to be coupled with this concept of sin, does, And then this promise that through formation, through partnering with God, we can move away from disconnection into connection. We can move from fracture to restoration. We can move from these vices towards the virtues that we are called to, has really helped me. And so I landed on the 7 deadly sins. And again, did not expect to be there. My calling is to be translating the treasures of the Christian tradition outward to those beyond the church. It's really unusual for me, actually, to be speaking to a group of Christians. It's really lovely. But again, I was like, okay, Lord, you want me to be writing about sin in public for a non-Christian audience? Are you sure? And then this old concept, which, again, you might be more familiar with, but in the UK, it's not like it's taught in churches, very occasionally maybe in Catholic churches, but generally no. It's a meme, right? It's a way people frame LinkedIn posts, the 7 deadly sins of bulk email fundraising, you know? The 7 deadly sins of year-end accruals. It's a silly cultural meme. There's a Magnum ice cream range based on the 7 deadly sins, and the vanity one is silver cake decorating balls embedded into a champagne-flavored coating. That's the vanity 7 deadly sin ice cream. There's horror films, right, named after the 7 deadly sins. It's not the idea that it could be an actually helpful lens for self-reflection. Seemed like nonsense to me. But as many things, I had to reassess my priors and my prejudices and realize that the desert mothers and fathers in those very early centuries of the church who took so seriously this gospel that they withdrew from society to be formed together and individually into this different kingdom and this different story, knew how human beings work. They came up with this list or lists because they understood how we disconnect, how we withdraw from the love of God and the love of other people and what our own soul actually needs. And it's helped me. And it feels extremely relevant and applicable for today. So I'm just going to talk you through my understanding or my way of narrating these sins for now, and then we're going to focus down on one of them, which I think is particularly live all over the world, but perhaps especially for you guys in this season. And so I started with wrath. I think you probably say wrath. I don't know why we say wrath. It doesn't make any sense, but we do. And I came to understand this as a subset of anger that is really the anger that disconnects, the anger that withdraws. There are forms of righteous anger that are holy, actually. We see Jesus getting angry at injustice and the oppression of the poor. But wrath, in my understanding, is contempt, is the bit that shows up all over society now in polarization and division, that allows us to externalize evil into other people and other groups rather than addressing it in our own hearts. And so I wanted to move from polarization to peacemaking, and we're going to come back to this one. I started thinking about avarice, which is just a way of saying greed, but distinct from gluttony. Avarice as the love of money. When we accumulate wealth, when we take more than we need, and believe me, I can feel myself tensing up even talking about it because we are all implicit in this, right? I can only look out of one eye at how incredibly challenging the New Testament is about the love of money. I don't really know what to do about it, but spending time with it has made me realize how much trying to create my safety in my savings account, in my pension, in taking more than I need, in accumulating stuff I don't need to try and create a sense of identity, to impress other people. I own 17 face serums. Why do I? I don't know. I find it soothing. And the thing about avarice, the thing about greed, is that it disconnects us from each other because the early church lived in interdependence and they met each other's needs. And one of the things that money does is it means we don't need each other. And when we don't need each other, when we don't need help, when we don't need to share, when we don't need to display our vulnerability to each other, it's really hard to know and be known. It's really hard to have equal interdependent relationships. And I see in the early church a community that needed each other, right? That shared what they had. I'm a hypocrite about all of this. This is not judgment. This is me saying, I think in our times, one of the deepest temptations to disconnection is one of the deepest soul dangers is that we will build bigger and bigger barns rather than turning to each other and seeking to live lives of interdependence. Acedia, another Latin word that often gets translated sloth and just means, sloth in our culture means kind of lying on the sofa and watching too much Netflix, right? That's my association with it. The actual word is, it's a bit like you can't really translate shalom straightforwardly into peace. You can't really translate acedia straightforwardly into laziness. It's much more about spiritual apathy and failing to pay attention to the things that we want to form us. It's about distraction. And so when I'm trying to grow up my soul and find spiritual core strength and find fully alive in this area, it's really about how do I pay attention to the things I want to form me. That for me is living in community and trying to do morning prayer and compline and get a more rigorous trellis or scaffolding for my soul than just showing up at church once a week and hoping that that will counteract the many, many hours I've spent randomly scrolling on my phone. Acedia, again, I think it's endemic for our times. How do we take back our formation? We take back our attention. And there are many forces working to make that difficult for us. Envy. Status anxiety. Anyone ever feel that? Imagine if you had walked into here and watched you all chatting and having canapes and you probably could tell, this is uncomfortable, brace, who thinks of themselves as high status and who thinks of themselves as low status. It shows up in how we carry ourselves and how we speak, how we listen to other people or how we talk, right? So much of our lives are these almost unconscious, very granular status maneuvers. What do? That is basically, how do I peg you on my internal unconscious status ladder? Are you worth my time? Am I worth your time? Right? And it's very rarely done out of an ill spirit, but the radical call of my tradition is that none of that matters, right? None of it. Maybe the opposite. The people who have the higher status in our culture, Jesus is not that interested in. Our gospel does this incredible flip and says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are the meek. Right? To know our own belovedness and our own value and our own worth, not because of anything we own or how we look or how much money we have or any of these other external signifiers, but because of what Jesus did for us, is so liberatory. And when we can be at home in our own skin and really not take seriously the status maneuvering of the world, we can create space for other people. We can liberate other people to go, oh, maybe I don't have to play these games. Maybe I can just know myself to be beloved in the eyes of the Lord and then go and do the work that is mine to do. Not worry about all this posturing. Gluttony, I think of as numbing. I don't think it's just about eating too much food. Feasting is one of the disciplines of the church through the centuries. We feast and we celebrate and we enjoy, right? But when we eat too much or drink too much or scroll too much or work too much or use online porn or online shopping or overwork to stuff down our feelings, that's gluttony, I think. That's numbing. That's disconnecting from our own soul and what we long for, which is generally to take those hard feelings of fear or anger or hurt and lay them at the foot of the cross and receive healing. My friend Laura Fabrici calls the Psalms emotion processing technologies, right? You guys pray the Psalms in your church and it is a beautiful thing. We take our fear and our anger to God. The Psalms are brutally honest. They lament, they say, I am angry or I'm afraid. And they allow us to feel it, right? To go down into the depth. Lamentations is all the depths. To take those things to God and then come out again and say, to whom else shall I go? Why so downcast, O my soul? Yet I will praise him. And if we don't do that, but instead, in my case, watched 3 back-to-back rom-coms on Netflix, where do those feelings go? That doesn't connect me with the God who wants to heal me. It numbs me to myself. It disconnects me. Lust, I'm going to skate over because I had to write that chapter incredibly carefully. I hope you buy the book and tell me what you think. But there is a lot in there about disconnecting from each other's vulnerability and treating other people as objects. That's what I think my definition of lust is. And pride is really a way of talking about sin, because it is the bit of us that does not want to be interdependent, does not want to be made for a relationship, does not want to need other people or others to need us. Is terrified of the vulnerability of knowing and being known, of acknowledging the fragility of our human condition, the bit of us that wants to be God, right? That's what the fall was. We were in intimate, interdependent relationships with God and between each other as humans. And almost immediately, we decided we didn't want that. We wanted control. We pulled back into ourselves. We turned it in on ourselves. And real community, where we know and are known, where we are interdependent, where we share our needs and meet each other's needs and weep when each other's weep and celebrate when each other celebrate, are how we become fully human and fully alive, and it is beautiful. And thinking about these as movements, not binaries. I can move towards these virtues. I can move towards fully aliveness. I can move towards relationship, and then I will mess up and I will withdraw. By the grace of God, I can start again the next day. Has really helped me. It feels doable, right? It feels like a journey, like a path I can be on with others that has been modeled down the centuries. And so I'm just going to drill down into one of them before we end. What do I really mean by attending to our formation in one of these areas? And so I'm going to talk about wrath, because I don't need to tell you that we are very divided. The US is amongst the most divided countries in the world. Weirdly, it's you, Spain, Sweden. Who knew? We're the second run, dangerously divided, but not trenchantly divided, according to some research. And that's why I started my podcast. I thought it's getting harder to love our neighbors. We are pulling away from each other rather than moving towards each other. It's like the social level disconnection, social level sin, and the cultural formation is actively accelerating that. What can we do? And through digging into that, I came to understand two things from our kind of sociological understanding of humans. One is we all prefer people like ourselves. Scientists call it homophily. My friend John Yates calls it people like me syndrome. And I want to tell you, we all have it. Every single study shows it is a constant across cultures and a constant across centuries. If you see someone hurt who is wearing the football shirt of the team you support, you are 50% more likely to stop and help them than if they are not. I feel more comfortable initially with tall women. Small women make me feel like the Hulk. Small women, I come to like you very quickly. I just need to tell you that, right? I was giving a talk to 4,000 Mormons in Salt Lake City the other day, which was a very unusual experience for me. But backstage, I got talking to another British person, and we were immediately like, oh, hi, hi, other British person. We felt immediately warm to each other. And it is absurd. I was walking down a train. I saw someone using the very specific brand of pen that I like and I have to seek out. And I swear my brain went, they seem like a good person. Right? I swear to you, once you start noticing who do you feel warm to and who do you not feel warm to, it is almost definitely because they remind you of yourself. It's a bit embarrassing. It's a really embarrassing thing about humans. We scan the world like Narcissus, looking for fragments of our own reflection. And if it's not because they're reminding you of yourself, it's because they're reminding you of someone that you already like. Or occasionally because they are expressing that they like you. George Eliot says it's this amiable vanity, that if someone acts as if they like us, we're more likely to like them. People like me syndrome is constant, standard. It doesn't make us terrible people, but healthy societies mitigate against it by forcing us into shared institutions and giving us a shared story and bringing us up against people not like ourselves on the regular. Our societies, as I think you can probably see, are doing the opposite. Sociologists say that we are in a demographic big sort, which means while we used to live alongside or worship alongside or work alongside people not like ourselves, that's getting increasingly rare. People go to school with people from the same class, background, religion. They marry people more like themselves. There is less mixing. There is less being forced into relationship with people not like ourselves happening. And then we have an information environment which is actively working to accelerate our people like us syndrome. It is showing us the worst of people not like ourselves. And because we're unlikely to actually be in relationship with groups different from ourselves, we can't fact check it. We say, yeah, sure, those people are terrible. Whatever it is, Republicans or Democrats, Muslims, Christians, people who disagree with us on even the smallest thing, we will have an instinctive withdrawal from. People like me syndrome, really helpful to understand and notice in ourselves. I also came to understand that fight or flight is like steroids for people like me syndrome. Fight or flight is this bodily response. It's a rush of hormones that our body releases when we're in a threat situation. It's designed to keep us safe when we're in physical danger, right? But we also experience fight or flight when we are in situations of cultural threat, social threat, disagreement, when someone expresses contempt for us, our tribe, our identity, our beliefs, cortisol and adrenaline. We'll be in fight or flight. You feel, if you ever had an awkward conversation with someone where you're just like, oh, I really don't, I'm really not gelling with this person, or they seem not to like me, or they've said something I radically disagree with, and you can feel that just tensing up. That's it. That's what's happening in your body. And what fight or flight does is it shuts down the bit of you that can be empathetic, curious, and open, and makes everyone look like an enemy. And we are, as a culture, our cultural stories are deliberately triggering us into fight or flight. We're more likely to click on content that makes us fearful or angry. Our news knows that you will keep watching if they are creating content that makes you fearful or angry, that triggers you into fight or flight. Your formation, unless you are avoiding things very carefully, will be triggering you into fight or flight more often than you were 5 or even 10 years ago. Combining that with the big sort and with the changes in the information environment means that we have this, and you've seen all the graphs, you've seen, the radical acceleration of division and polarization. But we have a savior who knew this about humans, right? Jesus is not surprised that this is how we work. And he gives us a model for countering it. He gives us counter formation. He gives us a different story. And I am trying to pay attention to the New Testament because what I see there is someone who is an anti-polarization person. Jesus will walk into a scene in the Gospels and almost wink to camera, find the most outsider person in the whole scene that is going to cause the most social censure, ruffle the most feathers, offend the most purity laws, and off he goes, and he sits with them. It was that was a divided society too, believe me. There were gangs, there were tribes, there were people who disagreed with each other vehemently. And Jesus just flagrantly doesn't care. He's just setting off these social bombs wherever he goes, leaving behind everyone going, what? How is he seen with that person? How dare he share a platform with that person? Part of what we can do to be formed into being peacemakers is we can choose to spend time with people not like ourselves. We can actively choose to be open and curious and empathetic towards people who might be triggering our people like me syndrome, who we might not automatically feel warm towards or relaxed around. We can ask them questions and we can hear about their lives and we can work out what might it mean to love them as neighbors. We can resist people like me. Jesus also does this thing where he talks about turning the other cheek. Have you ever read that? Do you know what to do with it? Who's been hit in the face recently? Some of you might have. I know there's some people who have, there's some military personnel around here. I don't know if this comes more in your world than in my world. Maybe I have no understanding what the military is. But I never knew how to apply it, right? It's not something I have to deal with. I was like, well, if anyone hits me in the face, I'll try and remember that I'm supposed to turn my head. Is that what you mean, Jesus? When you get hit in the face, you get triggered into fight or flight. When someone insults you or your family or your tribe or your beliefs, you are also triggered into fight or flight. When someone who is not like you walks into a room and you're not sure if they like you or not, you are triggered into fight or flight. And what fight or flight does is it makes you want to attack. That's what the fight is. And it might not be attack physically. It might be just dismissive, contemptuous, insulting, eye-rolling. Or it might be flight, which is, I think, probably as common, which is just withdrawal, disconnection, withdrawing into Christian parallel cultures, avoiding being anywhere near them. Turn the other cheek means resist your fight or flight and stand your ground and keep eye contact and attempt to keep that conversation going and keep that relationship going. Let the cortisol adrenaline wear off and you'll be able to see that person as someone made in the image of God. We can turn the other cheek. And Jesus goes one further because he doesn't say just love God and love your neighbors. Do you remember who else he says to love? Your enemies. Love your enemies. Love the people that hate you, who dismiss you, who pour contempt on you, who think that you're absurd or ridiculous. We are called not to get into that defensive posture, but to bless them. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And if Christians, including me, were able to actually embody this at the level that I think we could, if we took our formation seriously, we could change the dynamics in our nations incredibly rapidly. I've seen this happen again and again in my own life as I've practiced this. And in many situations where if someone attacks or criticizes or comes at you and you respond not with an attack back or with a withdrawal, but with openness, with a question, with curiosity, I often just say, do you want to come for dinner? I cannot tell you how fast things turn around. I've got friends that I have made after they attacked me for being a public Christian who came for dinner, and now I love them and they love me. Those are just some beginnings that are in my chapter about wrath, about what it might mean to be being formed into the kind of people that the world needs. I'll leave you with this. I'm such a beginner. I feel like a fraud actually trying to tell you about any of this because I've got so far to go to be growing into the kind of person that I see might be possible in this extraordinary invitation that my tradition offers. But I feel better. I feel steadier knowing that there's something I can be doing, right? I can be making choices around my attention and my responses and my relationship in partnership with the Holy Spirit. And it's much more interesting than living in anxiety and threat and tribalism. And it feels closer to carrying the fragrance of Christ wherever I go. Thanks. I want to be becoming the kind of person the world needs. I want steadiness of soul in turbulent times because it may not be the end of the world. And there's been many other end of the worlds, right? The fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Rome, the plague sweeping through Europe. And at our best, Christians have been able to respond to those moments, not with self-protection and hoarding and picking up our guns, but with a radical act of hospitality and loving our neighbor that made other people want to join our communities because they saw a different story. This is a real life verse for me, and it really speaks to what I'm trying to do and the ways I want to be fully alive and fully human. Those who trust in the Lord will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots. That's what I think some of this means. See, paying attention to our formation is about sending out our roots by the stream into the living water. Trees like that, people like that, do not fear when the heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought, and it never fails to bear fruit. That's from Jeremiah 7. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I forgot to explain how the flow of the evening goes. So I'm going to bring you back up in a second, if that's okay. And I'm going to ask Elizabeth a couple questions, 2 or 3, and then I'm going to open it up for all of you to ask questions. And we have till about 6:40, and then I'm going to let Elizabeth go so you can buy her book over there. There's 16 of them, so get them quick. And then you can order one if you miss it. And then if you have kids in youth group, 7 o'clock is the deadline for that. But I'll bring you back up if that's okay. Sorry I didn't give you much of a rest there. So I was listening. I have the hard copy, but I was listening to your book, which you can also do. But one of the things you say, and you sort of obviously addressed it tonight, but you say you want to normalize sin, and I love that actually. And someone has said, fallenness is sort of the great equalizer, right? If we imagine that we're the good people and they're the bad ones, then it's easier to have a sort of false sense of self. But listening to your book, listening through, and really, I guess some history here. If you're making a confession in a church and you're preparing for confession, one of the ways that you do that is to go through the 7 deadly sins and to look at your life that way. And so when I was listening to Elizabeth's book, it really felt like an immersive sort of self-examination. It brought out things in my own life that I was less aware of, and brought things to light that I need to confess ultimately. But my question for you is, how do you practically do that? I mean, you're not just listening to your own book day after day. So what are ways that you find, if you're going to normalize sin, if you're going to talk about it realistically, and you're going to talk about it in your own self and not just in other people, then how do you actually face that, and what do you do about it?
Thanks. Yeah, I would say primarily I want to talk about it in my own self. I think part of the reason so many people are put off the church is they see us pointing out the sin in them, the speck in their eye, and not paying any attention to the plank in our own. Because I live in a small community, so my husband and kids and I have moved into a home with another family. And living up close like that is extremely helpful because can't hide. Those of you who are married or have partners will know that the worst bits of yourself become very visible when someone lives up close with you. And I think having people up that close who are not my spouse, and so have less of those entrenched patterns that you can get into in marriage, has been very helpful. Like we very, very gently challenge each other occasionally, but it's much more that we sort of know that it's visible anyway, and so we can talk about it, and then we can pray for each other in it. I'm really struggling with this thing, or I can't, they will hear me getting very angry with the kids, right? And afterwards I'll come and they'll be able to pray for me that I will be able to be steadier and more compassionate. So it's partly that, and that's sort of what I mean by community. It's really hard to live as a Christian when we are not known or seen up close. It's much easier to be in denial. And then I do kind of prayer journaling, which is helpful for just sort of getting down what's actually going on in myself and in my head. And just trying to spend time with the scriptures every day, even if it's just one verse, often is the thing that makes me go, "Ooh, holy, holy." This is just like, that is a mess in there. So yeah, the trellis and the practices and the structure are really necessary for me because I'm otherwise massively distractible.
I think it's maybe in the God chapter at the end. You talk about an atheist friend of yours who brings his kid to church because he wants his child to be able to believe. And so obviously we're in an era where it's harder. It seems like progressive, creeping secularization, fewer people going to church, hard to pass along the tradition to our families. It's not exciting always to go to church, right? It's hard to fit in our busy schedules. But what do you think? You seem to say something like your friend seems to say that it gives his child an opportunity to see beyond just the materialism of the world. Can you say more about that?
I think it comes back to this question of formation. So he's like third generation atheist, and he has become intellectually convinced that religion is good for the world and good for individuals. But he'd like to be a Christian, but it's like he can't get there metaphysically. I don't know if you know anyone like that. And this is proper nerdy, so forgive me for a second, but the frame that really helps me is the work of a guy called Ian McGilchrist, who is a psychiatrist, who has written a book called The Matter with Things and The Master in His Hemisphere, and he talks about the different ways that the right and the left hemisphere pay attention. And the left hemisphere of the brain pays attention to the world in a way that basically makes the world look like a machine. Inanimate, flat, parts not wholes, like an engineer, right? the right hemisphere, and he knows this because of paying attention to when you have a stroke in one of each hemisphere, what kind of attention that you're left with. It's very, very rigorous book with many graphs that I don't understand. The right hemisphere sees the whole, sees relationships, sees interconnection, sees living things, not inanimate objects. And it's the seat of creativity and faith. And what happens when we pay attention is that we strengthen those pathways because our brain is it's called neuroplasticity. But you can think of it as just habit. You know how this works, right? The more you pay attention to a thing, the more real it becomes. And so we live in a left hemispheric world that has taught us to see the world as a machine and then set up the world like a machine and rewarded seeing the world as a machine. And in this era of technology and AI, that's the extreme version. And for people who that was their formation, so this friend of mine, Matthew, all he's ever known is a left hemispheric world, right? His formation was that is the story. That's the cultural story that he was raised in. And so those neural pathways are extremely strengthened to him. And it's almost like he's lost this language. It, I think, is a mother tongue, but he's forgotten how to speak it. What taking kids to church does, I think, is it holds open their ability to speak that mother tongue, to see the world as interdependent, interrelated, and animate and beloved. And honestly, I have real doubt sometimes, and there's days where I don't believe, but I want the formation of right hemispheric forms of attention, of ritual and imagination and creativity and interdependence, because that makes belief possible, even on the particular day that it feels hard. And the metaphor that he found really helpful was, if you make a kid learn a musical instrument, they will hear an orchestra completely differently than if they don't. Like, the formation of learning a musical instrument changes your actual brain. The formation of going to church changes your brain. And for a very scientific materialist worldview, sometimes it's really helpful to explain it like that. If you want to believe and can't, go to church. Pay attention in this right hemispheric way, and you might find you're able to see the world as it really is.
I'll ask one more question, then we'll pass it along. You gave us some really, toward the end there, incredibly helpful tips for communicating with people who it's hard to communicate with you, and you're basically a pro at this. That's like your job, communicating with people who are coming from totally different places. And most of us, that's very hard. So obviously you gave some tips there, but I also want to say, are there any tips, and your book is sort of an example of this, but of articulating faith to those who might be curious but are not, maybe don't have the language yet, without watering it down? Because we're not just trying to say Christianity's a nice way to be a better person, right? Yeah. Like, there's something more. Yeah. But you're not going to jump straight into sort of Trinitarian ontology, like you said. So how have you found ways of meeting people where they are, but sort of, I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? Maybe not.
So I think listening is magic. I think listening and asking good questions is the answer to many problems in the world. And so I would just start, earn the right, frankly. People don't, there's an old youth work saying, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. As I was saying, if you demonstrate actual interest, affection, care for someone, they're much more likely to listen to you. It has to be real, obviously. This posture of, I like atheists. I like people who don't believe in God. I like people who think Christianity is nonsense, and I want to bless them, right? And eventually, with some of them, I earn the right for them to ask me questions about what I believe. So serve people, bless them, attempt to love them, listen, help understand where they're coming from. And then I think there's a reason that the God chapter's at the end. And I did some evangelistic training at various points in my Christian journey, and it was always start with the gospel, right? There's this formula, there's this doctrine, and that's what you need to incept into somebody, and that's success. I have a kind of missiological hunch now that the formation can come first. That for exactly the kind of people we were talking about, anything that is an actual truth claim is going to bounce right off because they don't speak that language anymore. But you can belong without believing, and you can practice without believing, and you can find these ideas psychologically astute and life-giving and more humane than the story that the culture is telling. And it's not that it doesn't matter if you believe it or not, it's that might make it possible for you to have an encounter. And so I tend to really want to talk to people about the love of God, but to do it when I've earned their trust enough and to not always start with it.
We sort of talked about this yesterday. How do you balance? And I think I'm coming to think I've gone through different phases of this. I am convinced that formation is hugely important, and I know that in a sense life deforms. It's like the status quo deforms us. It makes it hard to believe. It makes us. Yeah. It's hard to be a loving anything, right? Yeah. Parent, friend, spouse. So formation is our sort of resistance against that. How do we keep that from becoming another point of anxiety in our life? Yeah. The gospel, in some sense, relieves us of that. Jesus has done for us what we can't do for ourselves. Yeah. But he also, like you're saying, invites us to live, in him. And so, how do we embrace formation without anxiety? And maybe this is an ongoing question. You don't need to solve it today, but any tips?
So I think some of this will be temperament, right? Some of us have more perfectionistic temperaments and are much more self-critical than I am, who lets myself off very easily. But I think for me, it now feels like it's from desire. It's not, I don't feel like I'm trying to save myself. I know that grace is a gift of God. I am known and loved and accepted as I am. But I can still be a douche and making the world terrible. And I would prefer to be becoming the kind of person the world needs. It really, Jesus said the enemy comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come to give life and life in all its fullness. And it feels like a promise that I want to move towards. It feels better. It feels freer. It feels more fun. It feels more loving, right? And so certainly where I am at the moment is it's not a source of anxiety. It's desire. And when I fail, which I do regularly, and then I can ask for forgiveness and be released from it, I just want to get back into that. And partly, actually, what I found is it's a solution to my anxiety. I'm anxious about everything, all the things I can't control. I can surrender that to God because I'm not God. Be like, what is in my hands? It's loving my neighbor. Let's get to work on that. And it just puts my attention into a more realistic place, I think.
That was beautiful, and thank you. I'm going to let Elizabeth escape to sell books. Let's give her another hand, really.